So today we're talking about the church. My special guest is my friend, Bishop Greg Palmer. Greg's having a little bit of technical difficulties, so let me talk to you for a little bit. I was going to do that at the beginning anyway, but I'm rambling a little bit longer until Greg gets connected. And we're going to talk about the church. And church is interesting, I think. I think until I went to seminary, I just thought, I don't know, I thought church was like a building, and you went there and maybe you became a member of a church. I don't know. That's just kind of what church was. So I have some slides that I want to show you. So here's the first slide. And this is our church. This is my church where I work, where I met Lisa, where we got married. Marriage Spark United Methodist Church. It looks like a church. People who don't know anything about church, they recognize that this is a church. It's an institution. And is that what church is? I remember thinking about the institution thing. I read this thing once that Frederick Buechner said. He said that maybe the best thing that could happen to the church would be for the buildings all to go tumbling down and all the bulletins lost and all the budgets are lost. Everything's gone. Denominations, all that's gone. He said then all we'd have left would be Jesus and each other. He said that's all we had in the first place. That's kind of interesting, right? So is the church, institution, buildings, bulletins? Is it people and Jesus, which we'd hope for? Interesting times now. I learned this thing when I was a little child. Maybe you did. Here's the church. Here's the steeple. Open the door. Oops, no people. Here's the church. Here's the steeple. Open the door. Oh, there are the people. Except now we're back here, right? You open the door, you don't see any people. Where's it made to be the church when the people can't come together? What's it all about? Here's another slide that I think is pretty interesting. This is the artist Giotto did this fresco of St. Francis of Assisi. Francis, he was a church guy. He was part of the Roman Catholic Church in Italy, growing up there in the 12th, living into the 13th century. But God spoke to him. God said to him, rebuild my church, for as you can see, it's falling into ruin. Well, Francis thought he meant there were some crumbling buildings and he should rebuild them with his hands. But God actually meant for him to reform the church. So Francis came up with a great plan for how to change the church, a great strategy, if you will. And he went to the Pope, Innocent, in that slide there, and he said, "Here's my plan for how to change the church." Now today we'd have multi-page strategies with a lot of business language and all of this, but what Francis brought, and we can find this document. It's in Assisi in the museum there. It's just a string of Bible verses, like Francis said, let's do this stuff. I love that. What's the church? Is it budget strategies, business plans, it's church of business? Maybe it's just Bible stuff. I was talking on the phone the other day to a woman, longtime friend. I did her mother's funeral, I don't know, 25 years ago. And we were reminiscing about her mother. And I remembered our church, our institution, up in Davidson. Word came down from the bishop on high that we were to do we were supposed to do a long-range plan, come up with some language for, what's the mission of the church? So I pulled a committee of people together and I said, we've got to name the mission of the church and come up with some language. And Mary Virginia Ratliff, Alice's mom that we were talking about the other day, Mary Virginia said, that's ridiculous. She said, the mission of the church is simple. We just do the stuff that Jesus told us to do. And we wrote that down and we sent it in. It was like a 1-minute meeting. So what is that, right? Here's some more ideas of what is the church. Here's another slide with some words, some foreign words. The first word that's a Hebrew word, kahal. So in Old Testament times, you have the people of Israel, and they're called a kahal. It's a gathering of people. In Israel, they were kin to each other. They were tribes related by blood, but not everybody. Other people were part of Israel back then, right? But they were the kahal. They were gathered people, and that's what a church is. We are gathered people, although these days it's hard. We can't gather. We gather virtually like we're doing right now. Another word, this comes up in the Greek New Testament, is the word koinonia. You may have heard the word koinonia. It means something like fellowship, something like that. But it's really interesting what koinonia means. If you read the book of Acts, it talks about the birth of the early church, and it says that they had koinonia. What that means is they shared all of their possessions in common. Nobody had private property. They pooled all of their, that sounds like communism or something, except it's a godly communism. It's not an ungodly communism. That somebody the other day said, Governor Cooper's order not to go to church is communist. Well, it's not communist. In communism, your possessions are seized from you. That's not what that was. But what we have there instead is people chose to share their possessions in common. This guy Clarence Jordan back in the 40s and 50s down in Americus, Georgia, started Koinonia Farms. It's still down there. I visited there, spent a night there once. Koinonia, same language. And they gathered, they pooled their possessions, they lived together, tried to reach out, change the world. Habitat for Humanity was birthed out of that. That's really interesting. And then we have our third word that appears in the Greek New Testament, ecclesia. This is so interesting. When I took New Testament Greek in seminary, one of the meaning of words. So the Greek word translated church is ecclesia. Well, ecclesia comes from ek, which means out from, and klesia, which means called. So the church, those are the people who are called out. That's not like calling you out like that. God calls us out. Like we gather together, we share life together, but God calls us out. The church is we're out. God calls us to be out in the world. That's exactly where we are now. While we can't gather in church, we're in our homes, we're in our neighborhoods, we're trying to make a difference in the world. Church goes on. Church never closed. We're always we're called to be out. It's an amazing thing. Here's another slide that shows us something about the church. This is Pope Francis. This is amazing to me. The church has always been defined as God's servant. We aren't just God's servants, but we are God's servant together as a church. And part of the genius of Pope Francis, one, he took the name Francis, right? So what did Francis do? Francis wanted to do the Bible stuff, right? Whatever Jesus had done, Francis made that his to-do list for the day. Pope Francis did the same thing. So what Pope Francis did when he first started, and this was really scandalous, is he went into a very poor neighborhood in Rome and he washed poor people's feet. And they weren't all Christian people, right? The guy that he's washing here in this famous photo is a Muslim. The scandalized people, the church is called to be a servant. Pope Francis has really shown the way. It's not about security and success and strength and great institution. We're amazing, beautiful, nice place for nice people to do nice things with other nice people. No, the church is a servant, and we go out and we serve others. And it's not the haves helping the have-nots. It's not that kind of serving. It's the way Lisa and I, hopefully in our marriage, serve one another. At our best, we do that humbly. We do anything for the sake of the relationship. Gregory.
Hey, I apologize for being the party pooper.
I think we're all right. We're together. I've been rambling, and they're probably delighted you're here, so I'll stop rambling. So, Craig, can you get us both up on the screen at once so we can talk to each other? I hope. Craig, can you get us on the screen together? I hope. But you can, okay, there we go. All right.
All right, James.
All right, we're together.
Good afternoon. Good morning.
Right. Whatever it is. Yeah, somewhere in the world it's morning.
That's right.
Greetings. Folks, let me introduce to you just one of the most amazing guys on planet Earth, Bishop Gregory Vaughn Palmer. He is the bishop, the Methodist bishop in West Ohio. He is a scintillating preacher. He's the preacher that preachers want to hear preach. He was the president of the Council of Bishops. He's just done amazing things. But for me, it's important. Greg's my friend. We were classmates together at Duke many years ago. And we stayed friends over the years. And Greg appears in our church periodically. I'll look back and there he is, because his children live in Charlotte. His son Aaron lives over in Chantilly. His daughter Monica teaches at Albemarle Road Elementary, at Albemarle Road School, where we've done some significant mission work. That's a great thing. So, Greg, thank you for joining us. I hope you and Cynthia are doing well.
We're doing well, and hope you and your family are doing well during this time.
We're doing fine. We're hanging in there. Lisa hasn't been too annoyed with me being in the house more, so it's a prelude to retirement. So we're talking about the church. I was rambling there for a while. I was talking about various images of the church. I remember when you and I were in school in some class, I read a book by Paul Manier called Images of the Church in the New Testament. And to me, before that, church was just church. But Paul Manier is saying church is, it's a servant. Church is the salt of the earth. Church is a boat. We go fishing. Church, all these things. So that's amazing. And this pandemic is forcing us to rethink church. I said when you were still trying to work out your technology, when I was a kid, I learned this thing, maybe you did too. Here's the church, here's the steeple, open the door. Oh, no people. Do it again. Here's the church, here's the steeple. Oh, there are the people. Except now there are no people. What do you think we're learning about church while we can't be together?
It's a great question, and thanks for having me on. And greetings to all of those that are tuned in from Myers Park and elsewhere. Among the things we're learning is that we're being driven to get at the essence of what is church and the nature of what it means to be in community, and in a particular community that's bound together by faith in the triune God. That we experience through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the power of the Holy Spirit, etc. And we're being pushed because for church, and back to the image of inside are the people, we assume that we're a gathered community, and that has been a part of being church. We send out the call. We have weekly services. We have weekly this. And so we built our lives around being physically together. And now we've been forced to be together in other ways where we're not in literal physical proximity to one another. And I think we are learning that we are still the church. So while we are physically distanced, a term I prefer to the social distancing, in some ways we are socially more connected, even though we miss the physicality of being together, and that will come back in due season. So the essence is relationship. We're built around the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. There's nothing that prohibits us from continuing to immerse ourselves in that narrative and celebrate that story. And someone was asking me yesterday about the singing part of church, and some who have returned physically to their churches are frustrated about the prohibitions around singing. And I said, well, it could be that they only sing when they go to church. And for me, I miss that, but I sing all the time. And as the saying that is attributed to our Jewish brothers and sisters, the one who sings prays twice. So I'm kind of prayed up because I sing my faith all the time. So those are a few musings I have about things that I've been learning, but don't take it that I'm not longing to be back in community. But I hope, and I've said this to folks in West Ohio, that if they started an online service during this time, if they upped their game on online services, I pray they won't stop even when we get back in our buildings and are together, because we're reaching and touching people that may not show up physically for a while to come.
Yeah, it's so we've reached people that we would never have reached. We were online before the pandemic, but it's expanded since then. So partly I rejoice. I was emailing the other day with a guy in Japan. I didn't know him. He can't come to my church ever. People all over the place, and I rejoice in that. Lisa did one of our yoga prayer groups yesterday, and there were 2 women there from the United Kingdom who could not have come to yoga and prayer in our. So I rejoice in that, but then I worry about the people. So I think, I don't know the name. There had to be somebody the last Sunday we were together who maybe hadn't been to church in a long time, thought, I'm going to give God one more chance, wandered in kind of nervously, maybe like the service well enough, but yeah, how do we, are we still connected to that person, right? Because there's so much in physical contact where somebody like that looks at me and they see me at the door and I can say, I don't know you. I'm so glad you can. We can't do that online, which is frustrating. Let me ask you this. A lot of people are like, we want to go back to church. We want to go back, use that language a little bit. I've tried to say that I hope God's not calling us to go back, but maybe God's calling us to go forward, right? Because everything back wasn't marvelous, right? So I wonder what new thing is God calling us to because of what we've been through? Is it like a deeper awareness of human brokenness? Is it, yeah, what do you think is the future that God would dream of for us?
Wow, excellent. I have resisted using the phrase back to normal, and I don't want to overuse the phrase there will be a new normal. But I do want to face forward and claim whatever the new normal is. And it occurred to me in recent days that the new normal will be changing every week, every 2 weeks, every month, et cetera. So the assumption that we get to normal, let's say tomorrow, and I'm making that up as a placeholder, what normal is as we stage our way into some different behaviors and ways of being together will be changing and moderating over a long period of time. So I think we are being called to be nimble, to be agile, and to let our faith inform that. I think, secondly, we are being called to move toward brokenness and pain. So I've been thinking about the Samaritan road, the road between Jerusalem and Jericho. I sometimes call it the Samaritan road, and many of you will have familiarity with that parable. And what stands out about the one that we've proverbially called the Good Samaritan is rather than moving by on the other side of the road for whatever good reasons the priest and the Levite may have had, the Samaritan moved toward the brokenness and the pain of a suffering person who was beaten and left for dead on the road. And then he saw the job through. So I don't want to preach that text, but it would be a good one. And what occurs to me is that COVID-19 has connected us to brokenness in some ways we hadn't experienced. We're used to solving things very quickly. We have the answers, and we are very capable. And we faced an intruder that kind of took the knees out from under us. And I mean, not just in the US, but I mean, globally. And in that, we saw there were layers of pain. So that would be about the disparities depending upon your race, ethnicity, your accessibility based on socioeconomic conditions. So I think the church is being called to move toward that pain. And I've been honored to watch the ways in which churches have connected with people, whether or not they're serving on a proverbial front line, our medical care folks, our first responders, the folks that have kept the grocery stores and the food chains going. We're being called in the last 48 hours and in the last 2 weeks toward the pain of what we've learned about what happened in Brunswick, Georgia with Ahmaud Arbery, and what we have witnessed and know thus far that happened in Minneapolis when George Floyd cried out with a knee on his neck from law enforcement, "I can't breathe." How are we learning to move toward that pain? Because that reality existed in some people's experience before we ever knew how to spell COVID or to pronounce it. So we're being called the church, being called to be the church that is merciful, compassionate, and is moved to action. And that's what the Jericho to Jerusalem road teaches us, to be moved with compassion and to move toward the pain, and then to act to alleviate the pain and to see the job through.
I mean, not so much. I keep trying to say to people, we had all kinds of issues before we'd heard the word COVID or used words like asymptomatic. There's a lot of stuff going on. I send out texts to my people and I'll say, how can I pray with you? And people, it's not much coronavirus related. It's stuff like, my marriage has been rough for a long time. It's a little worse now because he's home all day. The race situation, right? There's more going on in this country than COVID-19. And maybe, we hope, this vulnerable time will open us up to deal with all kinds of vulnerability. It's hard. Greg, you know that our church last year had an emphasis on mental health. And we have, it's Myers Park, Charlotte, and we have people, oh, they're so successful, they're doing great. And they love to tell you how great they're doing and to look like they're doing great. And every one of them is just a mess inside and broken and hurting and battling darkness. And the church ought to be the place where you name that and we bring healing to that and we can share that, be vulnerable with one another. I worry though, because we had a program yesterday online called Pandemic Resiliency. Bill Roth, our pastoral counselor, and Lauren Smith, our parish nurse, have been doing a weekly thing on just how to be healthy during the pandemic, how to be resilient. And somebody was like making dinging comments on there that are like, anti-churches being closed. I can go to Walmart, but I can't go. So this polarization we've had in the country. I originally had this dream that we'd shake some of that, but man, we seem just as polarized as ever. Even something like, let me ask you about this. This stirred up some controversy, and I hate it did. President Trump, what day was it last week? Thursday, Friday, I don't remember, said that the church is essential. Well, that spawned all kind of, typically, like everything else. But let me ask that question, right? Is the church essential?
Let me say, for people of faith, it is essential, obviously. And I want to say the church did not close. We ceased to gather physically in our buildings in large part. And there were always some outliers that never stopped for whatever reasons. So ministry has continued to go forward. And some people would say more robustly in some ways. I think from the standpoint that we've had to work harder, had to work harder at it. The church is essential for people of faith. We're called to be a part of the church. We're baptized into the faith and into a community of people that is in the business of helping us be formed to be more like Jesus. And we're in the business of helping other people around us in the church to be formed more like Jesus. The second reason the church is essential, not perhaps in the sense that was meant by the president. So I cannot say for sure what he meant and what was going through his mind. But it is essential if what Leslie Newbegin, the missionary bishop in India, said is that the church is the only, I'm paraphrasing here, the only group, the only organization, the only living organism that doesn't exist for itself. We exist for the people who aren't here. So we're essential in that sense that if we are to be salt, light, and leaven in the world, yes, we're essential because that's a part of our commission from no one less than Jesus of Nazareth. So essential in that sense. Our essence requires us to be at work in order to be who we've been called to be. So I think essential for the world. Let me be clear. I know that not everyone is a person of religious faith, let alone a Christian. But we're in the business of offering a compelling witness to the God revealed in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ so that people can choose to follow that Jesus and to serve that Jesus in the world, to participate with the triune God in healing the brokenness of persons and the brokenness of the world and building radical, healed, reconciled, beloved community. Here's the third way in which I think the church is essential, not exclusively essential. The church has propagated and birthed so many of the healing institutions in our society and culture. We stand apart from that now In some ways, they're like adult children. But if you think of the educational institutions that made education accessible for some when it wasn't for all, if you think of healthcare institutions, and I'm not just talking about the United Methodist Church, so just think of the health and welfare institutions. So essential in the sense that many nonprofit organizations, the church being among them, often give birth to other organizations, groups, and institutions that care for a specific niche of society, often the broken, the wounded, and the disenfranchised. So again, I'm using perhaps essential in a different way than President Trump did, but we're essential in the sense of living into the character that we have been called to have as people who follow Jesus.
I told my people in my sermon on Sunday that, everybody wants to get back to church, which I do. I miss people. I miss people so much, being able to hug and take selfies and chat and shake hands. It's great. I miss that. I miss the people horribly. But I told my folks on Sunday that when you come back in the building, I'm going to tell you what I've always been telling you is get out of the building, right? I heard a sermon one time. The guy was like, Jesus has left the building. I love that. Jesus has left the building. It's not like he's in here and we come here to find him. He's here, but then we exit the building with him and go out in the world. I'm always amazed by people that I've gotten to know who are good or making a difference in the world, and they really admire the church. If I say I'm a clergy person, they're not put off by that. Once they decide I'm not like the judgmental type, they're not put off by that, and they really admire the church even though they're outside the church, because they recognize we have a common cause. We want to lift people up. We understand that people are broken. We know that we want to make a difference. I'm thinking about that, what's the Churchill thing, where he said, I'm not exactly one of the pillars of the church. I'm more like a buttress supporting it from the outside. And we celebrate that. We're together. Another way I thought about this, I wrote a book a couple years ago by a theologian I love named Gerhard Lofink, and the title is The Question. And the title of the book is, Does God Need the Church? Now, he wrote a 400-page book answering that. How would you answer that, Greg? Does God need the church?
Yeah. Well, there are really two answers, but I don't want to place them as being oppositional. I think they are layered. I think we have to live in relationship to God in such a way that to understand the fullness and the adequacy of God is to look toward a being, we say the triune God, that is sufficient within God's self. But a part of the character of God and the nature of Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, Sanctifier, you choose your placeholders for that, is that God chooses to live in community with God's self and has chosen to live in harmony and community with God's own created order, which includes humanity. So in the sense that God longs to be at work in our lives as God's servants and followers in the world, God does need us in the sense that when you invite someone to share a life with you, it's not complete if they don't say yes and if they don't engage. So in that sense, God needs us. But God needs us to be faithful and to always be seeking not only after our better selves, but our better selves as seen through the lens or in the mirror of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So God doesn't need a church that's trifling. God doesn't need a church that doesn't have courage. God doesn't need a church that is perpetually frozen in fear because it wants to be not engaged in difficult issues in order to participate in the healing of the world. God doesn't need that, but God needs us to be all in, understanding our frailty, but understanding that God's Spirit is always wooing us toward the fullness of who we can be empowered by God and of who God is.
That's beautifully said. I'm getting ready for this Lincoln program that we're going to do next week, and one of the things amazing is Lincoln, he never joined a church. He he'd go with Mary sometimes, but he didn't like church. And it's not that he was anti-church, it's that as he read his Bible over time, he was learning more and more about what genuine Christianity was. And what he saw in church was a lot of pettiness and small-mindedness and all that. Anyway, so speaking of that, I promised my people we'd talk about an unpleasant subject today. It's not an unpleasant subject. The United Methodist Church, you and I, all our adult lives, we have loved and served this United Methodist Church, and I still love it. I've given my life to it. We love it. I did have a weird, couple weeks ago, weird sense of relief. I was home. I was not in Minneapolis at what was supposed to be this general conference where we assumed the church was going to get a divorce. And partly I was glad to be home, and Lisa seemed glad that I was home. But then I thought, well, I got to go back next year. I think we just reset dates, right? For in 2021, late August, we're going to have the general conference in Minneapolis. So you've been a key leader in the church. You were on the Commission on the Way Forward. You were president of the Council of Bishops. You know as much as anybody. Where do you think we are now as a denomination? Has the delay in the conference changed anything? Talk about that.
I think the delay in the general conference for good reasons, and not the first time it's happened because of a pandemic or a tragedy of some kind in our history, though it hasn't happened frequently, has given us pause to look even more widely, not to the exclusion of our most painful conversations in the United Methodist Church, but to look more widely at the breadth and the depth of pain in the human family. And I think COVID has been an invitation to that, though not the only one. By the way, speaking of being in Minneapolis, we didn't go to Minneapolis, but now Minneapolis has come to us. It was in my living room when I saw George Floyd with a police officer from Minneapolis, now fired, I understand, for 8+ minutes with in handcuffs, apparently not weaponized, with a police officer's knee on his neck and him gasping for breath. So Minneapolis has come to us as a world and as a United Methodist Church. I've seen bunches of stuff today splattered saying, are we still going to Minneapolis? Should we boycott it, et cetera? And I say, no, let's go there and maybe figure out a way to make a witness. So it's given us pause to look at the breadth and depth of pain that is not only about the things that we've been talking about as United Methodists. I think that will resurge, and I think people, I largely feel there to be a significant appetite for people of varying viewpoints and ilks about our struggle over human sexuality and homosexuality in particular, for relief from 50 years of the conversation. That doesn't make it good or bad, but there is a point at which all persons and institutions saying, I need relief. And I think people were wanting to be in Minneapolis, hoping that there might be a legislative solution that the delegates would determine that would bring relief and allow people to move forward in the lives that they imagine for themselves as the church, whether United Methodist or for some that might not imagine themselves to be United Methodist. So getting that relief has been delayed. Will we use the delay, the postponement, if you will, in order to find a more or multiple more excellent pathways toward getting toward that relief? And can there be more balm on our open wounds as a denomination during this time of getting to what ultimately is going to be decided, at least in terms of the book of discipline, by our votes? So, I wish that it was behind us. I would be lying if I said otherwise. I'm trying to say, okay, God, we didn't create COVID. How can we seize the pause to care for all that COVID has brought? And when we put our heads and hearts more back into the UMC game, how can we do it better with, so to speak, less pain and less victimization.
I get numb to it after a while, but it just can just be heartbreaking. And in ministry, a friend, we've been on opposite sides of this issue. And he was diagnosed with COVID-19. He was in the hospital. He was pretty sick. And I mentioned it in a sermon. I thought about that. I didn't want to text him and say, dude, you're wrong. What I wanted was, I wanted to pray for him. I wanted him to be well. That's the thing, is that we have relationships all over on this thing. I have a couple of cousins. They think so different from me politically. We're stuck with each other. We're cousins. We're always going to be together. We got to try not to hurt people. Got to welcome everybody to church. It's just the pain of my lifetime and yours, and it's just a sign of, does God need the church? Does God need this church?
Yeah.
God needs a broken church, and God's got it, right? God works through brokenness. God works through weakness, and we just got to name that and hope that God somehow brings good out of the division, like the family of Jacob. Those brothers were divided from one another, and God brought good, beauty, life out of that, and not just for that family, but actually for the whole world, right? Life was given to Egypt because of that family.
Yeah. Well, speaking of the sons of Jacob and the story of Joseph, we need, the church is needed in the sense we have the capacity to change the conversation and to pour out the rhetoric of our faith in words, and in our deeds that could literally, if the body of Christ could say, no, we stand for love, we stand for inclusion, we stand for covenantal relationships, we stand for the building up of community, and that means the building up of individuals, not the denigration of individuals based on sexuality, gender identity, race, ethnicity, zip code, etc. And God could use us. God wants, Greg Palmer believes, to use us to change the narrative. But if all the voices we're hearing are coming through media sources and from politicians that are in the business, mostly some days it seems, of working on their own reelections. And I think that happens without regard to party. And therefore they say things that are servant to that reelection, hopefully in their minds, or they avoid saying things that they think won't get them reelected. God needs us to pour into the culture, not just in America, but around the world, something that literally changes the narrative and invites us to a new vocabulary, a new speech that is not about the denigration of people, the talking down of people, but it is about the building up of people. And then to model the behaviors, that there is a more excellent way. And whether it has to do with our relationships over political conversations, over human sexuality, over race, and socioeconomics, we have got to model it. And we're great at making statements. The UMC is fabulous. Sometimes they're not as strong as I would wish on some subjects, but we have difficulty in modeling it. We've got all sorts of statements. For example, let's go to the race thing on racial inclusion. But, most of the churches I visit are pretty much precincts of a kind of a generic race picture, meaning they're all this or all that with one or two exceptions. The good news is, as we're planting new churches around this country, and I've seen this in West Ohio, we've planted 10 since 2017, and almost all of them have some growing and complexion and yearning that is racially, ethnically, national origin, socioeconomically diverse. And I think that's where the future is, that we've got to do life together rub off on one another in ways that my story and the stories of others affect me in such way, my story affects them, so that we hear difference, that we don't see difference as a problem, but as an opportunity to be embraced. So that when I go to my job, school teacher, banker, ditch digger, police officer, etc., I can choose to act in different ways, not just because of my training, but because I have relationships that help me to understand stories. And absent that, we will not ever make much progress to be invited out of our tribes.
I mean, you said that earlier, that the church is the one organization that doesn't exist for itself. We do exist for ourselves, but we miss it when we're only with people who are like us. And church ought to set the tone for the rest of society of how to be with people that are different. I have this little mantra that my people have heard me say, is that if you only hang around with people that are like you become arrogant and ignorant. And I'm pretty sure that holds for whoever you are. If you only hang around with people like you become arrogant and ignorant. And I just wonder how to name, whether it's over human sexuality, politics, all this stuff, how to name something. I heard Walter Brueggemann say on, so one Sunday morning I was driving in church and he was on Krista Tippett's show. And I just loved hearing his voice. And I love the way he named it. He said, everybody is afraid. He said, we fall into two camps. There are people who are afraid that the world that they've known and loved and treasured is crumbling all around them. And then there are people who are afraid that the world that they dream of will never come to be. And I don't know anybody who doesn't fit one of those two categories. And if we somehow name that, and what the Bible is about is kind of getting at that brokenness. And the number one commandment of the Bible is do not fear. The church ought to be a place where you're safe and you don't have to be afraid and you can name your fears. And I'm rambling now. Greg, let me ask you one last question. People's attention span on the computer is short. So let me ask you this in closing. What lately has brought some fire or life or joy to you in your reading and your devotional life and your praying, and what lately has just been cool and neat and fresh for you personally?
It probably grew initially out of some sermon preparation as we moved toward Pentecost. But in terms of Bible reading, the book of Acts is just exploding inside of me and pouring out, I hope. And I hope to make that a blessing to others, starting with this coming Sunday, where I'll preach an online service for Pentecost from one of the pulpits of one of our congregations. So the question that has stirred in me is, how do we write the 29th chapter of the book of Acts, the 30th chapter? Who are we being called to be as church? And what's so explosive about it in terms of my own discipleship, so not just the practice of vocation, is the boundary crossing that I see in the book of Acts, the engagement with the world as it is. I go to, Paul on Mars Hill. I think that encounter in naming some things and inviting people into a deeper conversation about a shared humanity and pointing them toward the God that we have known in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. So that's been spiritually uplifting for me. Another place I've gone, especially during this lockdown, is to two old friends, and they are books, but the old friend is Howard Thurman. I'm not letting on a personal relationship, but rereading some of his stuff, but particularly his Disciplines of the Spirit, which grew out of his teaching and preaching during his Boston years at Boston University and at Marsh Chapel. And he talks about those disciplines, commitment, prayer, suffering, etc. And that's been a blessing. And of course, his With Head and Heart, his autobiography, is always a blessing. And then devotionally, I've turned to a tattered old friend. It was tattered when I got it, because I got it when I helped a parishioner in my first church in Cleveland, Ohio, who was moving into the next season of her life, downsizing, and she had some of the guys from the church come over and help move her furniture out to do a yard sale, etc. And I came across this set of these green leather-bound books by Harry Emerson Fosdick. And the one that I'm referring to that I've turned to in this season has been The Meaning of Prayer. But he plunged the depths of all of these conversations, the meaning of prayer, the meaning of suffering, and the other subject matters, and short snippets and anecdotes, and just powerful. So I know that is a sort of a looking back, but for me, it's timeless. It's timeless stuff. In the contemporary, two pieces that have nurtured me. And I'm losing the name of the author right now, but it's the Nickel Boys, which is everybody can go Google it or whatever they do. The Nickel Boys is by a beloved author. It's contemporary, but he unearths this narrative of pain and brokenness about African American males that were in a prison or a juvenile detention facility. It is just masterfully written, and connects us with pain and invites us towards some hope if we're willing to do it. And the other one I've grabbed off the shelf is The Christian Imagination by Professor Willie Jennings, formerly of Duke Divinity School and now of Yale. So those have been a blessing, laying out the theological foundations for how race and the Christian faith and racism and the Christian faith, let me say, got so deeply entangled, much to the detriment of the church and to the body of Christ. But it too is a hopeful piece, because Willie always tells the truth and then invites people to a more excellent way. One more, James, if people are looking for a great podcast, Miroslav Volf of Yale Divinity School has a new podcast entitled For the Life of the World. He only puts it out once a week. It started during the COVID crisis, has wonderful guests on. He does great theological reflection, and it's just absolutely excellent and invigorating. So those are a few things that have been feeding me.
Those are great, Greg. Just mentioning Willie, that's a holy man that I just love. He's absolutely amazing. And the Book of Acts, what you see there is there's so much courage and so much joy, and they go together, right? If we don't act courageously, we miss out on the joy, right? That's amazing.
Yes,
Greg, we were you also mentioned Marsh Chapel. You and I were there together a few months back up in Boston, standing in front of Marsh Chapel. If you were in Charlotte during this pandemic, you call me up and we'll have a distance cup of coffee or something there, and that will be great. But no motion in the room.
Well, we have this energy efficiency thing where the lights go out if there's no movement. So I don't want subscribers to think I'm crazy, but that's what I was trying to do, was to get the light back on. Let's have a virtual cup of coffee as soon as we can.
That would be great. Thank you so much for joining us. You blessed our viewers and listeners. We're grateful. Greg, you have a blessed day. Love to Cynthia.
Thank you, and love to Lisa, and thank you for your ministry and friendship.
All right. Thanks, Brandon.